sometimes, the most terrifying threats in this world are not masked killers hiding in the dark or ghosts haunting an abandoned home. Sometimes, the most lethal monsters are completely invisible. They hide in the air we breathe, in the pets we love, and even deep inside our own bones. Today, I am going to tell you 3 terrifying, absolutely true medical mysteries. These are stories of ordinary people who suddenly found themselves trapped in unimaginable nightmares. Nightmares that baffled doctors, defied science, and proved to be far more deadly than anyone could have ever predicted. So sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself. Because by the end of this video, you will realize just how fragile the human body really is. Story 1. The Melting Skull. Our first story begins on a crisp, ordinary morning in Tokyo, Japan, in the year 2017. A 25-year-old man named Takuya Watanabe stumbled through the sliding glass doors of Keio University Hospital. He was in bad shape. Takuya was drenched in cold sweat. A severe fever raged through his body, and his head throbbed with a blinding, agonizing pain. But the most alarming symptom wasn't the fever or the headache. It was his right hand, which was firmly cupped over his right ear. Takuya was holding his hand there because his ear was literally leaking a steady stream of clear, sticky fluid. You would think that a symptom like this would send anyone into a state of sheer panic. But surprisingly, Takuya wasn't terrified. He was just heavily annoyed. You see, Takuya had a long and frustrating medical history. Since he was a teenager, he had battled a condition known as a cholesteatoma. It's essentially a highly destructive, recurring cyst that grows deep inside the middle ear canal. When he was younger, he'd had to undergo multiple invasive surgeries to have these cysts scraped out to stop them from damaging his hearing. For almost a decade, it seemed like the surgeries had worked. The cyst was gone. But about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, that familiar, annoying drainage had returned. He knew what it meant. The cyst was back. Takuya had put off going to the doctor because he simply didn't want to deal with another surgery. But now, he figured the stubborn cyst had caused a severe ear infection, which would perfectly explain his sudden fever and his pounding headache. He walked up to the reception desk, hand still pressed to his leaking ear, and explained his history. The receptionist took one look at his pale, sweating face, and immediately rushed him into the emergency room. About half an hour later, Takuya was lying in an air bed. He kept his eyes squeezed tightly shut because the fluorescent lights overhead were like daggers in his brain, making his headache so much worse. Through the darkness of his closed eyes, he heard the heavy footsteps of an air doctor approaching his bedside. The doctor looked over Takuya's chart and delivered the news. He said that based on the medical history and the fluid clearly draining from the ear, Takuya was absolutely right. The cyst had returned, and it had triggered a massive infection. But then the doctor's tone shifted. It grew incredibly serious. He explained that they couldn't just rush in and surgically remove the cyst, because they had a much bigger, much deadlier problem. Preliminary blood tests showed that Takuya's ear infection had been ignored for so long that it had broken through the barriers of his ear canal and spread directly into the delicate tissues surrounding his brain. This was a critical medical emergency. One wrong move, and the infection could cause irreversible brain damage or kill him outright. Hearing this, Takuya felt a wave of profound guilt and shock wash over him. If he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago, this wouldn't be happening. He opened his eyes, squinting against the harsh light, and asked the doctor what they had to do. The answer was immediate hospitalization and a massive, continuous dose of intravenous antibiotics to kill the brain infection before it was too late. 2 grueling weeks passed. Takuya remained in his hospital bed, tethered to an IV pole. Thankfully, the powerful antibiotics did their job. The infection was completely eradicated. His fever broke, and his headache vanished. But there was one terrifying, glaring problem. His right ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but every so often, a clear liquid would just spill from his ear canal. Baffled by this impossible symptom, the hospital doctors ordered a high-resolution CT scan. They needed to look deep inside Takuya's head to map out exactly where this returning cyst was hiding, so they could finally operate and remove it. Takuya lay perfectly still inside the massive, humming white ring of the CT machine for what felt like an eternity. When it was over, a nurse wheeled him back to his room to wait. A little while later, his lead doctor walked into the room. But he wasn't smiling. He wasn't holding a surgical plan. The doctor looked deeply troubled, almost horrified. The doctor stood at the end of the bed and told Takuya that he actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a split second, Takuya felt a massive wave of relief. He thought his body had somehow healed itself. But that happy feeling was instantly shattered when the doctor finished his sentence. "The reason you don't need surgery," the doctor said, his voice trembling slightly, "is because there is no cyst in your ear at all. The real problem is much, much worse." The doctor handed Takuya a printed image from the CT scan. When Takuya looked down at the paper, his blood ran cold. Takuya did not have a cyst. He had an impossibly rare, horrific medical condition called Gorham-Stout disease. In the medical community, it is more commonly and chillingly known as vanishing bone disease, for reasons that science still cannot fully explain. A person's body will suddenly turn against itself and begin aggressively breaking down and consuming its own skeleton. In Takuya's case, the disease had targeted his skull. His cranial bones were literally dissolving, melting away inside his head like an ice cube left out in the summer sun. And that clear fluid that kept leaking out of his right ear. It wasn't pus. It wasn't an infection. It was Takuya's own brain and spinal fluid, spilling out through the newly formed, jagged holes in his disintegrating skull. At the time of this story, and even today, there is absolutely no cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The absolute best the surgeons could do was rush Takuya into an operating room and use a specialized medical-grade bone cement to desperately plug the dissolving holes in his skull, hoping to keep his brain fluid from leaking out completely. Miraculously, the gruesome patch job worked. Takuya's doctors monitored his bone loss closely, and as of his last public medical update in 2018, he was alive and doing reasonably well, forced to live every single day with the terrifying knowledge that his own bones could simply start vanishing Again at any moment. Story 2. The Invisible Plague. While Takia's monster was destroying him from the inside out, the monster in our next terrifying story was hiding right in plain sight. It was a bleak, freezing afternoon in late January 2018. A father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 young children shared in their home in Madison, Wisconsin. His face was pale and exhausted. Dan grabbed his children's toothbrushes, threw them violently into the garbage can, and grabbed a heavy-duty bottle of chemical disinfectant. He began furiously scrubbing down every single surface in the room. The sink, the mirrors, the counters, the door handles. The sharp, burning smell of bleach filled the air. Dan was doing this because he, his wife, and all 3 of their kids had just been diagnosed with severe strep throat. According to their family doctor, the only way to break the cycle of illness was to take heavy antibiotics and deep clean the entire house to kill whatever lingering bacteria had caused the infection. But as Dan scrubbed the porcelain sink until his knuckles turned white, a profound sense of frustration and helplessness washed over him. Because this was not the first time he was doing this. Over the course of just 4 months, Dan's entire family of 5 had come down with strep throat 6 separate times. No matter how many prescription antibiotics they swallowed, no matter how many times they boiled their silverware, washed their bedsheets in scalding water, and bleached every square inch of their home. It was like the bacteria was immortal. It just kept coming back. This medical loop was especially maddening for Dan, because he was actually a professional biologist. He studied microorganisms for a living. He knew exactly how bacteria functioned, and he had already systematically eliminated every logical source of the infection. Nobody at his workplace was getting sick. Nobody at his wife's office was sick. And miraculously, none of the other kids at their children's school or daycare had caught it. The bacteria was trapped solely inside their house. But where? Dan walked out of the freshly bleached bathroom and went into the kitchen. He stared at the massive stack of pill bottles on the counter. He distributed the medicine to his 2 daughters, ages 6 and 3, who were lying completely miserable in their beds. Then he walked into the master bedroom, where his exhausted wife was cuddling their 1-year-old baby boy. The baby was burning up with fever. Looking at his tiny, vulnerable son, Dan felt his heart break. He was a biologist, a man of science, yet he was completely powerless to protect his own family from this invisible plague. Dan knew the doctors were missing something. He pulled out his phone and called his mother, who happened to be a retired pediatrician. He begged her for any theories, no matter how crazy they sounded. His mother listened to the symptoms, the timeline, and the failed cleaning attempts. Then she suggested a theory. It was a theory so bizarre, so incredibly rare, that Dan knew most traditional medical professionals would laugh in his face if he even brought it up. But at this point, he had nothing left to lose. Dan started calling local doctors and specialists, pitching his mother's wild theory. Just as he predicted, every single one of them shut him down. They told him it was biologically impossible. They refused to test it. A month later, in early March, the nightmare reached its terrifying climax. Dan and his wife sat in a sterile, freezing hospital room, staring at a heart monitor. Their 3-year-old daughter was lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and breathing heavily through an oxygen mask. She had caught strep throat for a 7th time. But this time, her tiny body couldn't fight it off. The infection had mutated into a severe, aggressive case of pneumonia. As Dan sat there holding her little hand, he realized with absolute horror that his daughter might actually die from this. He was on the verge of a total psychological breakdown. He knew the answer was out there, but no doctor would listen to him. As they watched their toddler fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him with an idea. "What if we stop asking licensed doctors?" she whispered. "What if we ask a medical student? Someone young, someone who wants to prove themselves. Maybe they would be willing to test your mother's crazy theory." It was a brilliant Hail Mary. Dan immediately contacted the University of Wisconsin. On April 4th, 2018, 6 agonizing months after the very first strep outbreak, a curious veterinary student at the university finally agreed to help them. Dan and his wife carefully captured one very specific item from their home, put it in a carrier, and brought it to the university lab. The student took a swab, ran the analysis, and stared at the results in absolute disbelief. Dan, his wife, and his mother had been right all along. There was a 6th victim living in the Levitas home. Their beloved pet cat. At the time, almost the entire veterinary community firmly believed that cats could not catch, carry, or transmit human strep throat. That is why every doctor had refused to test the animal. But the lab results were undeniable. The cat's throat was completely colonized by the exact same, highly resilient strain of strep bacteria that was hospitalizing the children. The cat wasn't showing any severe symptoms, so it went completely unnoticed. Every single time the family took their antibiotics, cleaned the house, and finally got healthy, they would sit on the couch and pet their furry companion. The cat would rub against their faces, purring, and instantly reinfect them all over again. Armed with this shocking revelation, doctors finally prescribed a heavy dose of specialized animal antibiotics for the cat. After one final, massive deep clean of the house, the Levitas family's terrifying medical nightmare was finally cured for good. Story 3. The Death House. For our final story, we travel back in time to September 30th, 1964. A 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood trembling outside the wooden door of an apartment in a small, quiet city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, inserted a brass key into the lock, and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark and completely silent. Charlotte was here because she was living a nightmare. Just a few days prior, both of her parents, who were only in their 70s and in perfectly good health, had suddenly dropped dead on the exact same afternoon. According to the local authorities, the events were a tragic, but natural, medical anomaly. The police believed that Charlotte's father had suffered a massive, spontaneous heart attack while making tea in the kitchen. When Charlotte's mother walked in and saw her husband dead on the floor, the sheer trauma and shock caused her to suffer a fatal heart attack as well. They called it broken heart syndrome. Charlotte and her husband had flown all the way from Wisconsin to Germany that very morning to handle the funeral arrangements and pack up the apartment. Up until this moment, Charlotte had been trying to be strong. But standing in her parents' living room, looking at their coats still hanging on the rack, the grief violently overtook her. She collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, wanting to comfort her, but not knowing what to say, gently walked over to the television and turned it on. He sat beside her, rubbing her back, hoping the background noise of the TV would help ground her. They just needed to rest. In an hour, their elderly next-door neighbor, a sweet woman named Caroline, was coming over to cook them a hot dinner. And later that evening, Charlotte's Uncle Dieter was going to stop by to help sort through the paperwork. About 30 minutes later, Charlotte was still resting on the couch when the front door opened. It was Caroline, the neighbor. She walked in carrying 2 heavy bags of fresh groceries, offering a warm, sympathetic smile. Caroline went straight into the kitchen, turned on the stove, and began to cook. Before long, the rich, savory smell of German comfort food wafted through the apartment. It actually made Charlotte feel a little bit better. A sense of normalcy was returning. When Caroline called out that the food was ready, Charlotte and her husband got up, walked into the kitchen, and sat down at the small dining table. They began to eat, waiting for Uncle Dieter to arrive. An hour later, Uncle Dieter walked up the steps to the apartment and knocked on the heavy wooden door. There was no answer. Dieter frowned. He knocked again, much louder this time. Still nothing. He leaned his ear against the wood. From inside, he could clearly hear the muffled sounds of a television broadcasting the evening news. But beneath the sound of the TV, there was an unnatural, heavy silence. No clinking of silverware. No voices. No footsteps. Feeling a sudden, creeping sense of dread in the pit of his stomach, Dieter reached down and turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped into the dim living room. "Charlotte," he called out. No response. The TV flickered in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows across the empty sofa. Dieter's heart began to beat a little faster. He walked slowly across the living room carpet, heading toward the doorway that led into the kitchen. "Charlotte, are you guys in here?" Dieter turned the corner and looked into the kitchen. Instantly, all the air left his lungs. His blood ran ice cold. Charlotte, her husband, and the neighbor Caroline were all sitting at the small dining table. Their plates of food were half-eaten. But none of them were moving. They were sitting completely upright, rigid, like mannequins in a department store. Their hands rested on the table. Their eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead at the wallpaper. They were dead. Dieter staggered backward, his mind completely unable to process the horrifying tableau in front of him. He spun around, sprinted out of the apartment, and ran out into the street to call the police. That instinct to run is the only thing that kept Uncle Dieter alive. When investigators and emergency medics arrived, they stormed the apartment. But they quickly realized this was not a murder scene, at least not a human one. The apartment would soon make international headlines and earn a terrifying nickname: the Death House. The medical examiner determined that Charlotte's parents had not died of simultaneous heart attacks days earlier. That was a completely botched diagnosis. Deep beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, a sewage pipe had ruptured. It was slowly, silently pumping lethal, odorless sewer gas, a highly toxic mixture of hydrogen sulfide and carbon monoxide, directly up through the kitchen sink. It was a phantom killer. It had quietly suffocated Charlotte's parents while they stood in the kitchen. And because the authorities never checked the pipes, they unknowingly sent Charlotte and her husband right back into the gas chamber. As the three of them sat at the table eating their dinner, the invisible, odorless gas filled their lungs, paralyzing their nervous systems instantly, freezing them in place as they suffocated to death in total silence. If these bizarre and deeply unsettling medical mysteries left you terrified, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We post incredible, gripping, and completely true stories just like this every single week. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 stories scared you the most. Until next time, stay safe and always trust your instincts.